Welcome to SpringLaw's Spring Forward Legal Updates webinar series. This series is designed to provide a comprehensive legal overview of key issues related to employment law and human rights in Ontario. SpringLaw is a virtual employment law firm advising on workplace legal issues for employers, employees, freelancers, and executives from a wide range of industries. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and find it useful and informative. To reach our team, please visit us at springlaw.ca. And now to our presenters.
Good morning and welcome to our Spring Forward Legal Updates Special Edition. We've had so many questions from all of our clients about reopening the office, and so we put together this webinar to really gather all the questions that everybody is asking and try and answer them all magically in a half hour. There's just a billion of questions of pandemic lockdown and remote working issues, so hopefully we can get through all of them today. My name is Lisa Stam. I'm one of the lawyers at SpringLaw, and joining me is my dear colleague, Jessyca Greenwood. We are employment and contracts lawyer at the virtual law firm SpringLaw, based here out of Ontario. Welcome to our clients who already know all about our webinars, and welcome to new people who are checking us out, and we hope you find this all useful. During the discussion, feel free to drop in any questions you have in the chat function, and feel free to download the slides as well through the handout section in the software itself. Finally, if you have any other questions after the webinar or you're looking for more information about our firm, come visit us at springlaw.ca. We have a bunch of resources there and a bunch of free resources there. Our award-winning weekly blog, our publication for COVID-19 for employers that we've been updating regularly since the beginning. So it's like edition 3000 or something right now. We're always trying to keep that up to date for employers. There's a link to our monthly newsletter, information about our innovative subscription program for employers, an ebook that we have on there, and a new product we recently launched called OMG The Office is reopening to try and provide useful budget-friendly resources for employers.
We'll definitely talk more about that.
Yes. We're lawyers and can't help ourselves, so of course we have a legal disclaimer for all of you. This is all legal information, not legal advice, and no talk is complete without us having some sort of disclaimer. So
there we go.
There we go, exactly. Okay,
So
over to you, Jess.
Thank you. The goal of our webinar today is to provide you with a lot of practical information about how to get your employees back in the office, making sure that you're following all the policies and procedures that you need to be legally compliant and to keep everyone safe and stop the spread of COVID-19. We all want to be back in person. There's so many good things about it, and I'm sure you've missed seeing your colleagues and employees. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Our overview and roadmap is just getting you back into the office, how to communicate that, where are your employees now, what policies do you have in place, how you will deal with resistance, and the hot issue that everyone is talking about is mandatory vaccine policies, how to deal with that and what that looks like. So without wasting any time, let's get right into it. If you are preparing to reopen, consider the infectious disease emergency leave. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the different models of getting employees back into the office and whether or not they need to be recalled from any layoff that you may have implemented during the pandemic. Recalling employees from layoff. So if during the pandemic and pursuant to the infectious disease emergency leave, which we'll shorten to IDEL because that's a lot easier to say, that IDEL is going to end on September 25th of this year. And when that IDEL ends, all of the pre-COVID rules that existed about constructive dismissal and employees' entitlements will resume. And the Ministry of Labour will again start taking complaints and investigating complaints for any non-compliance. If you've terminated employees or laid them off, you either have to bring them back or their entitlements will resume. So think about that, and if you need advice about any of those issues, definitely seek counsel, because that can help in navigating these issues.
Just a quick note on that. The Employment Standards Act in Ontario has a lot of sections on layoffs and how to do it and how many weeks you need to be out before is deemed a termination, etc. And so many employers do assume that they can just always access those provisions in the ESA. What IDEL did was it did let employers access the ability to lay people off, but outside of that unusual pandemic thing, and so after September 25, we all revert back to the regular layoff rules, which means unless you have a contractual right set out in your contracts with your employees, there is no legal right to lay off people without that contractual right. So IDEL has given employers this breathing room to get through the pandemic, but that breathing room is about to end. So just as a heads up, it can be distracting for employers that there's all these rules in the ESA, so it must be okay. But in fact, it's only okay if you also have a contractual right to do it. So things will heat up after September 25, we're expecting.
And that's a really good reminder for employers to take a look at their contracts that they have now. And it may be a good time to implement new policies if you're bringing your workforce back into the office. And so that's what we're talking about here. If you have employees and you want them back in the office, give them as much lead time as possible. Have you considered asking them for their input about their preference to come back to the office or not? Have you taken a survey or given your employees a hybrid model so that they could choose? Some can come back if they want to, and some can continue to work from home. The whole issue of working remotely means that employees may have the expectation that working from home is a key and integral part of their employment. And if that's the case, then the employee could establish that. And now as the employer, you plan to change that, the employee may assert a constructive dismissal. So you want to be really clear with your employees about what the expectations are, try to get employee buy-in, and definitely make them aware of any new COVID safety protocols and policies that they have to follow when they're coming back to the office. So anytime you're notifying them about coming back, that's also a really good time to bring awareness to the new policies that you may be putting in place. And as Lisa was just saying, and I mentioned as well, if the employee views working from home as a key part of their employment agreement with you, they may assert that they have that right to continue to work from home. So the more notice that you can give to the employees that you expect them back in the office, the better. And the longer you wait, the harder it will make it for you as the employer. It will make it more difficult to tell them that that's not part of the job. So be very clear about what your expectations are. And my biggest piece of advice here is develop a communication plan and have a strategy for how you will communicate your expectations to all employees to make sure that they know the rationale behind why you want people back. It's very important to have that open and transparent communication, and it will also encourage employees to provide you with feedback and hopefully be engaged. And so last part and last tip on that is really look at the contracts that you have. Take a look at what your policies are in the office and maybe consider updating those now. It's a good time.
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes over the last year. So it's if you're introducing other policies anyways, then it might be a moment of opportunity. Okay, so back into the office. So Jess just talked about prepping for that. Now let's talk about some of the issues around, the employees are now coming in. What does it all look like? So the number one thing if you can just go to the next slide, Jess. The number one thing is to really think through what your safety plan is going to look like. This is a Government of Ontario mandate. So for people in other provinces, I know we have a few that are from BC and other provinces, there will be a similar type of thing. You need to have some sort of safety plan to comply with that legal duty that every employer has across the country to keep employees safe under the Provincial Occupational Health and Safety Act or equivalent in your province. So here in Ontario, the Government of Ontario has done a good job actually of putting a bunch of resources online that can give you a good laundry list of the things to include. There isn't a one single version to use. And so if you're looking for templates or an off-the-shelf type of thing, it doesn't exist yet because we've got all these different workplaces and it'll be unique to your own workplace. But there are a common list of ingredients to include. It can be just a one-pager. This doesn't need to be a 400-page document at all. But things like, what will the physical distancing requirements will be? Is there going to be there should be some sort of daily screening. What will be your approach be to vaccines? And if people are unvaccinated, how are you going to handle that? Are there going to be extra PPE requirements, for example? Laying out what the ingredients are of your returning into the office plan. Like I said, the government does have some checklists for this or descriptions around all of this. And so it's a matter of pulling it all together. The key piece is you can have the most beautiful plan on the planet, but you have to share it with your employees, and you'll probably want to have it available to the public as well if you're a public-facing business. Partly for business optics and PR, it's just a good thing for your clients or customers to know what your plan is, but also so that there's just really open communication with your team, so that everybody knows what is required. Here is the hierarchy of controls from the Government of Ontario website. It speaks to the different ways to eliminate the risk of exposure to COVID. So, merely having everyone wear a mask is a good starting point, but you can see all the different controls that will add in extra layers of protection for employers that ultimately are about a due diligence that can help eliminate the risk or minimize the risk for employer liability, company liability, if there's some sort of COVID outbreak in that workplace or in your business. So the next one, how will you screen employees and customers if you're client facing? So some practical solutions here. The Government of Ontario and the different provinces will have an equivalent, a screening tool, and there's different. I'm sure you've all seen it. My kids' gymnastics gym has a great one. There's all different versions out there. You don't need to go get a software engineer. But something that allows for a quick and easy screening tool that allows you to record the information. That's probably one of the most key pieces, is that the information is coming back into the employer workplace so that you have this record. Again, it's a due diligence step. If anything should happen, you need to be able to point to this folder you have somewhere of the emails or the confirmations of the daily screening. If you are a business that has a public-facing component, and really most businesses will have some element of public-facing, your courier delivery, your, the water guy, you'll just have you'll have some, but if you're retail especially, that's a whole other thing. But really thinking through the journey of people coming into your workplace and where are the steps of potential exposure, and including that into your plan. So there are the contract tracing rules that the government has. So having clients pre-screening as they're coming in, lots of signage everywhere. If you're going to have a mandatory vaccine policy, hang that poster, that policy up, so that there's clear communication as they're coming in. Probably one of the more common day-to-day type of questions we're being asked is what happens if a customer refuses to wear a mask coming in? And it's as a business, you're allowed to say no. You're allowed to say they're not allowed to come in. But as you can imagine, it's going to be hard for some of your frontline employees to navigate this, and it could. Masks and COVID and vaccines have certainly polarized some people, and so to help de-escalate some situations, it's a really good idea to make sure you have some sort of script that especially your frontline, if you've got some teenagers working on the till, give them some help, give them some a script to talk through, and then help them know when to escalate it to a manager, so that it can just I don't think a frontline person should have to bear the brunt of all of this. If you are an office and you're dealing with clients and these are important business partners, that's very different than a one-off customer that's, maybe coming into your grocery store to buy one bunch of bananas. If it's a really important partner for your business, I know that there will be some business decisions to be made, but it still is, your duty as an employer to keep your employees safe is a really express statutory requirement. So it is a matter of balancing that, and it's having the policies and the script up front to just have them know that this is the thing. We are lucky that in Canada, the anti-maskers are far and few between coming into businesses. I think we've been lucky that it's been a fairly compliant place. The vaccines, I think we're going to see some more drama going into the fall, but hopefully the mask issue won't be overwhelming.
I saw a really good example of this when I was in a small business on the weekend. A patron came in and did not want to wear a mask, and I was already in the business, and I heard the interaction, and the manager was very kind and had a lot of patience, but said that these comments aren't appropriate and this anger isn't appropriate to be directed to our sales clerk, who was a teenager. And so she asked the gentleman to step outside to have a conversation. And then she said, "I'm happy to do your shopping for you and you can wait outside." And so it was a very kind and patient way of dealing with it. But you'll hear a lot of people say that they don't want to wear a mask, and they'll cite the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter applies to state actors. It doesn't apply to businesses. And there is a tension there and a conflict between what our civil rights permit us to do as individuals and your duty as an employer to keep the employees safe, as Lisa said. And that duty is very important. So it's good to think of these things ahead of time and have a plan.
Yeah, a lot of people learn of their legal rights on TV and are citing American law. So keep that in mind too. There is no charter right to be able to expose other people to COVID. So the last piece on this issue around, once you do reopen your office, it's always about good communications and really letting people know what's going on. It's probably a good time to introduce or update policies on this issue. No employment law session is complete without talking about policies, I know, but they are important because it does help reduce the employer liability. If you have no policy in place, you don't have anything to point to if something goes off, or if an employee, goes off in a direction that you don't like. It's hard to point them in the right direction or discipline people if they're not aware of what they were supposed to have done in the first place, or they can, purport to say that they didn't know in the first place. So having the policies are important. Again, having the policies is one thing. To the extent you can, have them acknowledge receipt, review, and agree that they will comply with the policies. Being proactive and having this communication plan is really important. I think also, giving people the benefit of the doubt. Most people, the vast majority of your employees, are going to just want to just tell me what the rule is and I'll do it. Everybody wants to be safe. I just want to get back to work. I'm busy getting my kids back to school. I don't want to have to reinvent wheels here. Just tell me what to do, and most will do it. For the odd employee that is resisting for whatever reason, like just gave that example around the store, just take them aside and have the conversation to understand what's going on. And we'll deal with accommodations in a moment, and we'll resistance. We can maybe move to the next section here.
Absolutely. So looking at what do we do if employees just don't want to comply? What are your options? And that's sort of what we've been dealing with, and what we've been seeing is employees who are faced with new policies, and maybe it's just the fact that the workplace is changing, the policies are changing, this is all new, it can be overwhelming. We really encourage you to have that communication strategy. And for the most part, what we see is that if the employer explains the rationale for why they're implementing a certain policy over another, and it's because of the employer's duty to keep the employee safe, it's hard for employees to say no to that. I mean, they want their colleagues to be safe. They want to be safe. No one wants to be taking COVID home to their families or spreading it. So for the most part, we do see employees come around with education and awareness that leads to more insight and an ability to have a dialogue. But I would expect in your workplace, if you're a mid-sized employer, that you are going to have some employees that do not want to comply, and there has to be a plan for that. So who will the point person be to deal with issues of non-compliance? And then how will you strategize about that? Will you have a dialogue with the employee? Will you see if there needs to be some kind of an accommodation request, or what their reason is? I think it's really important to investigate and understand that. And we really encourage employers to document all of those efforts and steps in the event that the employee needs at some point some kind of progressive discipline, like a reprimand, or if safety protocols aren't being followed, that may be a reason that you consider terminating the employee eventually. So all of this effort that the employer is making should be documented. And we've talked a little bit about constructive dismissal. If employees could try to assert a constructive dismissal if they feel that the terms of the employment are changing in a way that is repudiating that employment contract. But all of this, again, comes down to communication and trying to get employee buy-in and employee engagement. So mandatory vaccines and accommodation. This has been such a huge issue, and we're hearing about it in the news, and so many different organizations and governments making this mandatory. And so we wanted to talk a bit about this today and kind of what the state of the law is. This is certainly an area that we will see some litigation around, and it's not a new topic in the sense that vaccines have been imposed for school children to go to school. Certain unions in healthcare facilities and long-term care facilities have implemented vaccine requirements during different pandemics that we've had in the past. We've seen those types of rules put in place, but it seems like it's a very hot topic now and much more in the mainstream media than we've ever seen it in the past. So if an employer wants to impose a mandatory vaccine policy, that has to be based on evidence. And the evidence has to demonstrate that imposing that policy will create an effect of reducing the spread of the infectious disease. So that evidence-based reasoning has to be there, and the employer has to articulate that. And that's unique to your own workforce and your own workplace. So you have to be able to say that none of these other steps, like physical distancing or PPE, or having employees work from home, are going to be enough. Despite all of those efforts, we still need mandatory vaccines. It has to be something that the employer can articulate in that way for it to be allowed. And then there has to be a balancing, or at least room for a balancing, that's going to happen between this mandatory vaccine policy and its interaction with the other laws that employers have to follow, like the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Employment Standards Act. So there is that interaction there. And so the employer also has to be able to assess accommodations and look at whether or not they can be made. If you're thinking about implementing this type of policy, you definitely want to consider how you'll do that and how you will educate your workforce about it. You may consider having some kind of a form or an information sheet that you will pass out to employees. And then that form could include a vaccine an exemption form or a vaccine opt-out type form. We have a template for that. We're going to talk about it a little later on in the presentation, but there has to be some way to document any requests and consider the information that you're going to be collecting from employees. That is their personal health information, whether or not they've received a vaccine or are going to or do not want to. So you have to think about why you need that information, how it will be stored, and making sure that that's all done in a privacy compliant way. Mandatory masking. This is also a popular topic, and we've touched on it a little bit during our presentation, both in the examples that we've given, but we also get a lot of questions about this. There's some employees that say they can't wear a mask, they can't breathe when they wear one, or that there's some other issue with wearing a mask. So definitely look at whether or not it's appropriate, given how widespread masking has become and that it's required in going out in public in almost all settings. This is sort of becoming the norm. But if mandatory masking is something that becomes an issue with employees, is there an accommodation that's reasonable? Is there some other way that the employee could be accommodated that's still meeting the safety standards that you require for your workplace? For example, is wearing a shield an option that's available, or is the employee working behind plexiglass an option that could work, or could this employee be accommodated working from home? So it's really looking at both what's available to you in your business, in your particular environment and circumstance, versus your legal risk, because you have an obligation to accommodate employees up to the point of undue hardship. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but you have a duty to all employees, not just the employee who's asking for the exception, right? So if that person doesn't want to be vaccinated, they don't want to wear a mask, you also have this competing duty to your other employees who are doing all those steps. And you'll want to consider that and make sure you document all your conversations.
Yeah, and it's not even about whether or not they have a right to be vaccinated or not. It's your legal duty as the employer to keep your workplace safe, and that will often trump a lot. And I know employers have really sucked it up for 18 months and have really stretched to try and make it work in a really unprecedented time. But as we head into the fall, I certainly see that tide starting to turn. There's more appetite at law to just let the employer keep the workplace safe. Now that there are options, there just a year ago we didn't even know if we could get COVID from our apples from the grocery store. Now we know how it's transmitted, so there is more options, and I think that employers do have more teeth now than they did a year ago.
And so just dealing really quickly with accommodation requests, because I see the time, we're getting close to the end. There is Ontario Human Rights Code legislation that requires that employers do not discriminate against employees based on all the enumerated grounds which are in the legislation. And employees have the right to make an accommodation request. That mandatory vaccines may be the subject of a religious or medical condition, a request for an exemption, for example, and that has to be something that an employer considers, and the employer has a duty to try to accommodate that employee up to the point of undue hardship. And
that doesn't include personal preference, though. I think that's important. Like the medical piece, there are very few medical situations where a vaccine will be a problem. So it ultimately, practically, it will be a fairly narrow exemption on the medical piece.
Absolutely, and I'm seeing that in a lot of cases, people who have very serious health conditions are still being recommended to receive the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I've mostly touched on these points on this slide, so I'm going to skip over that and just head right to our takeaways, Lisa.
Okay. The key one is be proactive, not reactive. So having the policies in place up front and letting people know what your plan is, assessing the needs of your workplace and what's unique to your workplace. Think through the journey of your employees coming in the door, your clients, your customers, your vendors all coming in the door, and decide whether a vaccine policy is warranted. The reality is a vaccine is not necessarily a bulletproof answer to everything. So what other measures, what physical distance, what, the screening, all the other steps that are also part of it. But I know everyone's paying most attention to the vaccines right now. Developing these policies and rolling them out with the clear communications and education, and then balancing that safety versus human rights, and people will whip out their human rights and charter rights, but it's actually a narrow range that would apply to. Your legal duty to keep people safe will probably trump most of the situations, and then frankly it becomes a business decision at some point. The risk of losing a bunch of business because of a bad headline of being a super spreader might dictate some of your decisions as well. And then, if there are some unique things to your office, looking for some specific legal counsel. What we have done here is we've gathered all of the questions that we keep. I mean, regardless of what industry you're in, there is a commonality of questions across the board in most. Hospitals probably a little bit different, but in the private sector space, there is a real commonality. So what we have done is we've gathered all the most common questions and put together this budget-friendly toolkit. Here are all the ingredients in the toolkit to try and help employers just be able to get caught up with what their legal obligations are, get caught up on some of the employment contract changes that have happened over the last year and a half. The key thing that I think people are really, we're getting a lot of good feedback about is we have a pretty comprehensive FAQ on all the different questions people are asking about reopening the workplace after 18 months of working remote, and what are all the legal issues to think through, plus a bunch of checklists to help make it smooth and hopefully cost effective. So we're making a pitch for this. If you have any questions about, some unique things to your workplace, we're always happy to do the regular hourly one-on-one bespoke work. But a lot of our common questions is we're trying to offer up this pretty unique package that pulls it all together for a more cost-effective approach. Just come to our website. You can just go to springlaw.ca if you're interested in the OMG package, and you can just buy it there and download it at your convenience. Now, we had a handful of questions, and I think it would be good for us to get to them, but what we can do is, it's 11:30, people have places to go, things to do. Our webinar is it's being recorded and will be put onto our YouTube channel that you can find on YouTube or through our website. But we're happy to stay for a few minutes and answer some of the questions, but we just want to give people the chance to drop off and know that you can check out the video after to get to some of the questions.
Sounds
that
great.
Works for you too? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me scroll. There's a bunch of them, so let me just scroll to some of them. So here's the first one. What if a customer tells us they don't need a mask due to a medical exemption? Do we need a form or something for them to sign? Do we need to let them enter? So this is a customer saying this.
That's a tough one. I mean, hearing from a customer that they have a medical exemption and not seeing any proof, I think is difficult. If they have a doctor's note or something like that they're prepared to show, that might help in terms of assessing the risk. But I think you have to assess the risk in that scenario and see whether or not that's something that you can accommodate. And if not, then I think you wouldn't let them enter.
Yeah, and as a business person, it's hard to ever say no to a customer, but this is a moment where the safety of your employees is going to be a pretty big legal duty to really pay attention to as well. Okay, here's another question. Policies on vaccinations. It seems that many employers are mandating vaccinations, but does not seem to have any teeth for those who do not get vaccinated for no valid reason that we know of. And it's true. What we're seeing is employers saying you must get a vaccine unless, right? And then a vaccine exemption form, which is we have both a mandatory vaccine policy and the exemption form in our a DIY toolkit as an example. And the exemption form lets employees describe why they're not able to take the vaccine or not willing to take the vaccine. And then once you receive that information, and then we're sort of back to, okay, if you're, running a daycare of like high risk children with all kinds of medically compromised conditions, you will be very justified saying, sorry, you need to comply with all these medical procedure or all these safety procedures before you can be in that workplace. If you're in office where it's very easy for this person to work remote, that might be the nature of the accommodation you do. But it'll always be a question of having that conversation to see if they're suggesting that there's a medical exemption and they're seeking an accommodation, then you run into your usual rules around being able to ask for medical documentation for that.
Right. So continue the dialogue, gather information, and then assess.
If it's what I think we'll see is if it's an employee who's been kind of a pain in the neck for many years and just a bit of a troublemaker in the first place and just wants to be defiant for no reason, at some point I think we'll start to see some terminations, and whether that's a with cause termination is probably another story. It's lower risk to just pay them out a bit and be done with it and not have to explain, but it'll be interesting to see. And it's hard for us, as I always want to give very specific and practical advice, but in this case, it will really depend on your workplace and to what extent is a vaccine seen as a mandatory thing. A related question that just came through: if not getting the vaccine is a personal choice, do you have to accommodate?
If the employee just simply doesn't want to and they have no reason, what I would say about that is it may appear that they have no valid reason for not getting the vaccine, but upon speaking to them and having a dialogue, you may find out that they're actually afraid of needles, or they heard that the vaccine can lead to blood clots and their parent or someone they know died of a blood clot. So it may be out of fear. And there could be room for education and awareness and to continue that dialogue with the employee. But if they are just simply refusing and there's no further information that can be gathered, and they are unwilling to engage in any kind of dialogue with the employer, then I think you have to assess the risk as it's presented to you. You're not being asked to accommodate any condition. And so I think then you can document that, you can ask them to comply, and if they won't and they won't have a dialogue, then I think you need to look at what other steps you can take and if it's reasonable to keep that employee or not. But in that situation, probably get some advice before terminating.
Yeah, I mean, all of the human rights case law on accommodating a disability, for example, always speaks about the two-way street, right? That the employer, the employee can't expect the employer to read their mind, and there needs to be an exchange of information in order to deal with the situation. So there is that. If an employee is suggesting that there is a medical accommodation that they're looking for under the grounds of disability under the Human Rights Act, then the employer is entitled to some further information. Let's see, if we allow everyone to work remotely, but if they choose to want to be in the office, can we require mandatory vaccinations for them to enter? Is that allowed? If we don't force them in the office, it's their personal choice. Yeah, you know what? I think that's an ideal scenario because there's options then, right? And so for people who really, I know there's a whole movement of body autonomy and not wanting, forcing people to inject things into their body, that there's an issue with that. Fair enough. And so if these people then if you happen to have a business where ongoing remote is fine, and as a business owner you're okay with that, and there's options, and I think it will be far easier to require vaccinations if they want to come in or to stay remote. What will be tricky though is if job opportunities start to become uneven because they're remote. So you might down the road, trip up against claims that they were disadvantaged because of this. But that, you know what, that's a bridge to cross down the road, I would say. Let's just get through the fall and hope that the fourth wave is a little mini ripple that we can all ride and get through okay. There's a lot of uncertainty yet. As we record this now, it's the end of August, and we have yet to see what's going to happen in September and October of this year. Let's do one more question, then I'm mindful of time.
Okay, great.
Just want to make it, let me just see, there's a couple here. Can we ask employees for proof of vaccination?
I think that if you implement a vaccine policy that makes mandatory vaccine, you've assessed the evidence-based data and it's appropriate for your workplace, you've determined that's a step you need to take, then you can ask employees for that information. But you do need to be mindful that that is personal health information. There's privacy laws that are applicable, and you will want to make sure that you comply with those. So that's storing that confidential information in a secure way and making sure that only those who need to see it have access to it and no one else.
Yeah, and like you don't want to store it in your Google Drive where with all the other stuff. It is good to separate it out for sure. There's additional layers of privacy requirements around that. There's still a ton of questions coming in. So if people want to drop off because they got lunch to get to, that's fine. But let me do one more. If we supply masks that provide more protection than the standard cloth mask, can we require that employees wear the masks provided by the employer?
If you've determined that a mandatory masking policy or you have a PPE policy is appropriate, and that's it's the same as the vaccine situation, if that's what you need to keep employees and your customers safe, I think you can require them to wear a specific mask because you have a valid rationale for why you're implementing one mask over another. But you'd want to be able to point to some evidence that that mask is in fact more effective if you were challenged on it.
Just from a practical point too, employees who say they can't breathe in their mask, maybe they just have a really crappy homemade mask that is really hard to breathe through. Surgeons will go 8 hours doing surgery. It's super concentrated work in an enclosed room with masks on, and they don't complain. I just think, but they're probably wearing masks that are more breathable than some of the homemade DIY type masks that we've all been using. And so, it's just part of that dialogue to ask if, is your personal choice because you hate wearing a mask because it's hard to breathe? Well, have you tried this one instead? I mean, people just might not think of it. We're all total decision fatigue around COVID at this point. So, it's trying to keep it friendly at this point is still very useful.
Well, that's going to conclude our Spring Forward legal update for today. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar, which will be on September 15th. Details and registration are to follow. Good luck with all of your reopening plans, and if you do need any help, keep in mind we've tried to reduce some barriers for getting checklists and policies in place by creating the OMG toolkit for you to reopen. So please take a look at what's in there and see if that would help you get your workforce back in the office.
Thank you for joining, and good luck with all your reopening plans.